Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, as you all probably know by now, Monday, a draft opinion of a Supreme Court case overturning Roe v. Wade was leaked to Politico. The case involves a 15-week abortion ban that contains no exceptions for incest or rape. Although Roe v. Wade is the case that initially established abortion as a constitutional right, the current standard is Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And Casey says the government cannot prohibit a woman from seeking an abortion before the age of viability, currently around 23 or 24 weeks. Now, if the draft opinion is in fact representative of the majority of the Supreme Court's view, it will have the effect of ending the constitutional right to an abortion. Going forward, states will have the power to promulgate laws that limit abortion access absolutely, regardless of whether conception occurred as the result of rape, incest, whether the pregnancy threatens the mother's life, or even whether the fetus is viable. Currently, 22 states have total or near total abortion bans on the books. Now, this outcome is contrary to what a majority of Americans believe should happen. 54% of Americans believe Roe should be upheld. Only 28% believe it should be overturned. 60% say that their state should either make abortion easier to access or keep access the same, while only 1 in 4 say it should be harder. Overwhelming majority say that abortion should be legal if a woman's health is endangered in cases of rape, incest, or serious birth defects. The fact that this court opinion is so out of step with public opinion has led some to argue that the decision is an example of inappropriate judicial activism. As Fox's Ian Millhiser put it, the opinion was written and joined by, quote, 5 unelected aristocrats, 3 of whom were appointed by a professional con man who received 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton and decided to do a tyranny. But as Glenn Greenwald pointed out in a recent piece on his Substack, this is the whole point of the Supreme Court. It was designed to be an anti-majoritarian check on majoritarian power. The Federalist Papers are clear about the perceived danger of factions united against the rights of other citizens. As Glenn writes, when the court strikes down laws that majorities support, it may be a form of judicial tyranny if the invalidated law does not violate any actual rights enshrined in the Constitution. But the mere judiciary act of invalidating a law supported by a majority of citizens, though frequently condemned as undemocratic, is in fact a fulfillment of one of the court's prime functions in a republic, which is what we have, a republic, not a direct democracy. Now, many people were angry at Glenn for this take because they read it as Glenn agreeing that there is no constitutional right to abortion or making some moral claim and siding with anti-abortion activists. But Glenn's argument was narrower than that. He's simply pointing to a basic truth. You can make the argument that the Constitution does, in fact, provide for the right to choose by reading an applicable right to privacy clause in it, but abortion access having popular support is not a basis for dismissing the opinion. If you have a problem with the Supreme Court having an anti-majoritarian bias, you have to change the court. And many legal scholars have argued that the fix we need is to rein in the power of the Supreme Court, either by eliminating it altogether or by significantly weakening it. Now, that might sound severe, but consider this. The court's authority to review legislation and invalidate it on the basis of its unconstitutionality was itself claimed by the court in an act of judicial activism. It's not constitutionally or legislatively provided. Marbury v. Madison, the 1803 case in which the Supreme Court claimed for itself the power known as judicial review, has been settled law for over 200 years. But the fact that the precedent has been in place for a long time is not a barrier to overturning said law. Just look at Roe v. Wade, settled law for nearly 50 years. So what would the world look like with a diminished Supreme Court? Well, without judicial review, the emphasis would return to the democratically elected legislature. If it were to promulgate a federal law, it could only be undone legislatively, not by judicial fiat. Now, you might be concerned that the system of checks and balances between the courts and the legislative branch is there to protect minorities against the tyranny of the majority, as the Federalists are thought to have intended. But in practice, there are but a small minority of cases in which the Supreme Court has protected the rights of vulnerable groups. Most often, it protects an elite minority. Harvard professor Nico Bowie, who testified last summer at Biden's Commission on Court Reform, argues that historically, when there's been a disagreement between the court and the legislature involving the constitutionality of a law, the court has ruled in a way that is bad for populist rights. Listen to this back and forth between Nico and conservative jurist Ilhan Werman, who also spoke at Biden's Supreme Court hearings last year.
even if a wealth tax is unconstitutional at the national level, I don't think it would be unconstitutional at the state level. Let's say the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. I'm not saying that it is.
It's not.
Okay, fine. But Romney Care certainly was constitutional. So you want 390 million Americans to be able to govern themselves. But I think a lot of what the Supreme Court does is it stops Congress from doing things that imposes a uniform rule among the states. And the alternative would be, California can go its way, can have a wealth tax, can have a carbon tax, can do, Romney Care or Newsom Care, whatever it would be in California, and let Texas do something different. And God forbid that there'd be some diversity. So why isn't that like a perfectly reasonable vision of the court's role, keeping Congress in check and letting the states do things?
Yeah, so let's look at the history of the court's relationship to Congress. When the court has said, let's let the states do this, the first time was, we think the states should decide whether slavery should exist. Congress has no role in policing slavery. We think the states should decide whether lynching is punished. We don't need Congress or a federal anti-lynching law to do this. We think the states should decide whether an anti-discrimination law should pass. We shouldn't have a federal anti-discrimination law. We think the states should decide whether there's a wealth tax. We shouldn't have a federal wealth tax. We think the states should decide whether there's a child labor law. We shouldn't have a federal child labor law. We think the states should decide what to do about, you can go on. It's just whenever the Supreme Court says, let's let the states do it, it's to protect the interests of...
In an article covering Bowie's remarks at Biden's hearing on the Supreme Court, Joel Mathis wrote, over the last 2 centuries, the court has used its power to strike down or narrow federal laws that limited the spread of slavery, discouraged child labor, protected voting rights, and restricted the role of big money in politics. Defenders of the Supreme Court's power say justices can protect political minorities from congressional attempts to step on their rights. But Bowie said the theory has rarely worked in practice. Bowie, quoting Bowie, the court has been silent at best when Congress and the president have violently dispossessed native tribes, excluded Chinese immigrants, persecuted political dissidents, withheld civil rights from U.S. citizens and territories, and banned Muslim refugees. Combined with the lifetime terms for justices, he said, the political choices available to us as a country depend not on our collective will, but on the will of people who hold their offices until they resign or die. This is precisely what the Declaration of Independence protested. And even if for some reason you don't care about all those pretty severe infringements on American freedom, it is precisely because of judicial review that Democrats have been able to disguise their complete and total failure to legislate. They've been delegating lawmaking to the court while using the Supreme Court appointments as a cudgel to ensure voters continue to vote blue no matter who, even though the party rarely accomplishes anything. Case in point, the lack of abortion legislation. Despite Roe being decided in 1972, and despite overwhelming support for at least some degree of abortion access, Democrats have failed to codify Roe. Barack Obama wrote a 2-page missive yesterday on how terrible it would be for Roe to be overturned. But nowhere in this self-righteous ode does he acknowledge his own role in the crisis. In 2007, he claimed that the first thing he'd do as president would be to sign the Freedom of Choice Act, codifying Roe. By 2009, he changed his tune, saying the bill was, quote, not my highest legislative priority. Biden also ran on codifying Roe, but he has firmly resisted getting rid of the filibuster so that Democrats could actually do so with their narrow Senate majority. As friend of the show David Sirota wrote recently, there is already legislation introduced in Congress to do this. It is called the Women's Health Protection Act. It already has 48 sponsors in the Senate, and its core precepts are widely popular according to survey data. And yet Democrats do nothing. Biden was recently asked if he would consider eliminating the filibuster in the face of this Roe opinion. His answer?
I'm not prepared to make those judgments now about, but I think the codification of Roe makes a lot of sense. Look, think what Roe says. Roe says what all basic mainstream religions have historically concluded, that the existence of a human life and being is a question. Is it at the moment of conception? Is it 6 months? Is it 6 weeks? Is it quickening, like Aquinas argued? So the idea that we're going to make a judgment that is going to say that no one can make the judgment to choose to abort a child based on a decision by the Supreme Court, I think goes way overboard.
After that dodge, I can see why Biden's so attached to the filibuster. The only thing the Democrats seem good at is making money off of the issue of abortion. Yesterday, Biden had the audacity to issue a statement that was little more than a get out the vote / fundraising email. Quote, if the court does overturn Roe, he wrote, it will fall on voters to elect pro-choice officials this November. One Biden advisor told reporter MJ Lee that, quote, this will have an extraordinary galvanizing force with some of the very Americans who don't always turn out or weren't really looking to the midterms yet. Some leftists are starting to believe that Democrats want abortion rights hanging in the wind so they can continue to pressure disaffected voters to the polls. That's the whole game. But even if you aren't that cynical, here's what we do know. Women's rights are hanging in the balance because Democratic politicians, ignoring populist majorities behind them, have been afraid of the so-called culture wars. They've chosen to timidly court conservative minorities instead of passing laws that majorities want. Hillary Clinton picked anti-abortion Tim Kaine as her VP, and we all know that that really helped her to bring all the conservative boys to the yard. Pelosi's daughter Christine spent the night of the leak blaming the left for the erosion of abortion rights, but her mother, Nancy, has argued that focusing on abortion access is hurting Democrats and has seemingly worked overtime to make the Democratic Party a safe space for the anti-Roe minority. As friend of the show, Irene Frimpong has argued, the Dems have spent my entire life convincing Americans that the only thing they can do is appoint judges to do the governing for them. Now they failed at that. They're looking to blame leftists and Susan Sarandon, but they need to take a good hard look in the mirror. Marianne Williamson put it best. I don't know which is worse, the way Republicans abuse power or the way Democrats refuse to use it when they have it. I think it's a toss-up, Marianne, but I have a good idea why growing numbers of Americans are identifying as independent and looking for a third party. The solution to judicial activism, whether by the right or the left, may be to limit the power of the Supreme Court, power it arguably only has because of judicial activism. The Founding Fathers wanted checks and balances to preserve the rights of economic elites, not persecuted minorities, and the court has been extremely effective in doing so. I would argue that 200 years of that is enough. Now, Robbie, I know this is big talk.
We have some disagreements here. Yeah,
hit me. What's on your minds?
Look, this might just be a result of, frankly, our different ideologies. I can see why you might say that the Supreme Court has mostly been negative or serving as a check on laws or policies you would like to pass. From my perspective, it has, while there are plenty of Supreme Court and other court decisions I don't agree with or that have gone the wrong way or that have not protected rights I think ought to be protected, I can also think of a lot of cases of the Supreme Court and certainly other courts striking down laws that were enacted by idiotic legislatures that violate our rights that may have been supported by huge majorities. I can think of about three. There's a lot on speech, all the speech-related cases for the last 20 years, the extreme expansion of our First Amendment rights.
What's
from
an
the
example
Westboro
of
Church,
federal law limiting speech that the Supreme Court has struck down? Because I can think
flag burning. Or that was a state law.
This is Nico's point, because we went back and forth in this episode, and the third person who didn't speak, a law professor from Georgia, Eric Stiegel, he was kind of open to the argument, but wanted to press back against Nico and say it cannot be that there are not these examples. He tried to come up with a counterexample. I encourage people to go watch that full clip on YouTube. Come up with a counterexample that said, well, what if the government passed this terrible law that was so obviously bad and hurt all of these Americans? And he couldn't do so because at the end of the day, when things are so obviously bad, they don't reach this level. Legislatures don't push stuff like that through. They can't make it through on a federal level. There's already that kind of built-in check
all the expansion of our due process rights, search and seizure rights, all that stuff.
Name a case. I'm open
what the names
to it.
Of the case are, but the ones during the Warren era,
So this is
Miranda.
This was the one instance where there were a lot of federal laws that were frankly great, and they were not allowed by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was striking them all down against
sodomy. What about gun rights? That's
the thing. At the end of the day,
I know those are state laws, but I would like those state laws struck down by the Supreme Court.
You're not getting rid of the federal district courts. The rest of the court system remains in place. But the problem with the Supreme Court is it's able to strike down federal law. And when Nico's solid point is when there is a conflict between what federal legislatures, democratically elected legislatures, think is constitutional and what the Supreme Court, these unelected jurists, think is constitutional, the tipping point should go to the federal legislature because at very least there was a democratic accountability system built in there that doesn't exist with the
only
Supreme
reason
Court.
thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of private sector workers all around the country are not required to get vaccinated is because the Supreme Court said no to it. It wasn't a federal law because the federal government doesn't even make laws anymore. They don't even think they have to. They just use their massive bureaucracy agencies to do whatever they want, and the Supreme Court occasionally holds them in check. And I think that's an important thing. And
I think that we should live in a world where it's a lot more common and normal to change laws, to amend the Supreme Court, to have people have an active and democratic interest in changing the rules and laws in our government, not expecting to rely on a bunch of unelected people acting on fiat to change the laws that happen to work out for us in some cases, but in all of the instances that Nico set out. If you were Dred Scott trying to ride a train and being told that no, you can't because you're a black man, or any of the other overwhelming instances that have occurred throughout history where the Supreme Court has upheld the right to intern Japanese citizens and on and on and on down the line. I humbly suggest that a mask mandate isn't worth all of that.
If we had a SCOTUS that better reflected my views, they should strike down the Patriot Act. They should strike down things of that nature.
But it shouldn't. The argument is that it shouldn't be SCOTUS. It should be democracy, and that the problem
should be SCOTUS because the Patriot Act violates our very basic.
Look. Most countries don't have a Supreme Court. Countries that we think are very democratic, like the United Kingdom, don't have a Supreme Court. And this is another argument that Nico makes. We, I think, have America brand. We have a very hard time thinking about how the world could work outside of the institutions that we're very familiar with. And I think at very least, even if people aren't really to hop on board and push all of the justices out of the building, to say, at very least, let's have the thought experiment about how to better design our system. The founding fathers were just human beings that designed a system. They weren't sent tablets down from Moses on the mountain.
I'm not arguing about that, but I want a Supreme Court that vehemently strikes down laws that violate the rights that are protected under our Bill of Rights.
And I want our rights to be more responsive to the democratically elected legislature and for the people to feel like they have an opportunity to actually make the changing winds of popular consensus felt in our government and not be relying on standards from 200 years ago.
That is the difference.
Well, thank you for that back and forth, Robbie. We will have more Rising after this.